Hey everyone, Dogen here, and this is the Finances in Japan video. So in this video, I'm going to be talking about money in Japan. I'm talking about how I try to invest my money, how I manage my savings and that sort of thing. So I don't have too much time, maybe about an hour today, so let's just try and get into it immediately. I do want to mention that I'll be doing this as if on the assumption that the audience is someone like the majority of the audience is in the similar position to what I was in about 10 years ago. And what I mean by that is someone who wants to save more money, but isn't too familiar with a lot of investing terms like, I don't know, dividends or like deductions and stuff like that. So I'll kind of be explaining things along the way. So I apologize to anyone who already knows a lot about investing or knows more about investing than I do. So let's just get straight into it. First, one of the things that I want to stress right from the get-go is that Americans have it differently than almost every other foreigner in Japan because of the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service of the United States. And basically, it makes it difficult as an American to invest at all or save money in the Japanese investing system or the Japanese banking system. So I'll expand a little bit on that later, but if you're an American, try to realize as soon as possible that the best option for you is never to invest through into Japanese like mutual funds or funds that are even stocks from American companies, but they're a group of stocks that's managed by a Japanese company. So if you do that and you make a bunch of money in the stock market, because you're an American and you're doing that through a Japanese company rather than an American company, like an American brokerage, an investing company or individual, you'll be subject to much higher taxes. So yeah, just be aware of that from the get-go. Okay, so one of the first things, and this is pretty obvious to anyone who lives here, but Japan is, for the most part, a cash-based society. So what this means is, well, it's pretty obvious, but most of the transactions that are made every day are used with cash rather than with cards. And this is changing, but compared to the rest of the first world, the developed world, as far as I know, certainly compared to the States, people use cash a lot more here than in the United States. And I try and use only as much cash as I absolutely have to. And that's because when you use cash for everyday transactions, you can't get cash back on things like your credit card, and you can't get like points if you have like an Amazon card or like a Rakuten card or whatever, point-based credit card that you might have. So Japan is a cash-based society, but if you're trying to make the most of the money that you have, then it's best to limit the amount of cash that you have to only what's absolutely necessary, and try and pay everything else with a card that can get points or that can get cash back. So that's what I try and do. Another thing that I want to touch on real briefly, and this is because I didn't really know about this until, I don't know, maybe a couple of years ago. My brother, he works in Silicon Valley, and he's really into investing, and he's really smart, and he's really good with numbers. And I'm kind of the opposite. I'm much more like creative, and I'm not too good with numbers. But so something happened. He came and visited me not too long after my girls were born. And he said, so like, what are you doing with your money and stuff like that? And I said, well, I don't know. I just kind of have the money that I saved up in my bank account and like some of my PayPal account. And he was like, he almost got mad at me. He was like, you have to start investing this, because the sooner that you get involved with investing, the more that you can leverage that later on. So the quicker that you can get into investing, the better it is for you. So whether that's, even if you're still in college, whether you're about to graduate from college, whether you're already working, whatever the point might be, even if it's $1, even if it's $10 or $100, any amount is fine. You just want to start investing as soon as possible, because the sooner you invest, the more money that you'll have, both in the short term and in the long term. So invest. That's the number one message of this video. But okay, so another thing I want to clear up, because this was kind of a mistake that I made in a previous video. I said that I make when I receive money from the States, whether that's from my Patreon account or whether that's from like a bank transfer, whatever it might be, I said that I always try and do that through PayPal because I was under the impression that PayPal had the best rates, and this is not true. PayPal is not the best at all. TransferWise is. So there's this app called TransferWise, and you can use it in a browser as well, and it provides a significantly better rate than PayPal does. So I could have been saving multiple hundreds of dollars each month when I was transferring my Patreon income from my PayPal account to my Japanese bank account if I had been using TransferWise instead. So with PayPal, what you do, the way that I had been using PayPal is I would have my money in my Patreon account, and then at the end of the month, I would send that over to my PayPal account, and then I could pull that into my account or my investment, my brokerage firm, or I could pull it into a Japanese bank account. Basically, from PayPal, you can pull it into any account, but when you send it to Japan, the rate is very poor. And when you use TransferWise, rather than first sending it to PayPal, you use a service called Stripe, and that just allows you to send essentially, almost 100% of the money that's in that Patreon account directly to a specified bank account. So I would just send that all to my account in the States, and then only when necessary, I would transfer money from that account in the States, my brokerage account, to my to my Japanese bank account using TransferWise. So another thing I kind of want to stress is if you're American, if you're an American in Japan, I believe it's best to have as little money as possible in Japan and to have as much money as possible in your, excuse me, I just got to check something real quick on timing. Okay, 9 minutes, okay. Have as much money as possible invested in the American system. And I'll elaborate a little bit more on this in later. But whenever you're sending money from outside of Japan, inside of Japan, don't use bank transfers, don't use PayPal, definitely do not use a local ATM like at a convenience store to take out money from your like American bank account, because they'll charge you like $30 to take out like $300. Use TransferWise if you have a Japanese bank account. That's the best option. You'll save a lot of money in the long run, and that's money that you can then invest. So TransferWise, definitely the best way to send money to Japan. Okay, so another thing I want to talk about is how I invest my money right now. So, excuse me, I'm going to have a sip of water. So I didn't know too much about this because I've been out of the loop, so to speak, when it comes to like the up-to-date finance apps and stuff that are available to Americans, and that's because I've been living outside of the States for about 10 years. But there's a lot of apps right now that are kind of like one-touch solutions, like I think Wealthfront is one of them. I think Betterment is one of them too. You essentially make a single account, and then you just put, I don't know, maybe $100 a month or maybe $1,000 a month or whatever it might be into that account. And it's kind of like a robot investor. It'll just take care of investing for you. And I think this is actually a really good option for a lot of people, but Americans in Japan can't use these because these services are only available to people that are, again, Americans that are in the States. So, and this isn't related to what I talked about earlier in terms of, well, actually it might be, but the point is you can't use apps like Wealthfront or Betterment if you're living in the States. So things that you can do, however, are use some of the, there's a lot of high interest online savings accounts right now from various banks that as an American, you can create. So if you go to the site nerdwallet.com, they have a list of a bunch of different sites where you can create a savings account with the banks on that site online for free, even if you're outside of the States with some of the banks. And they'll offer really, really high interest rates on the savings that you have inside of that bank, at least compared to a traditional bank or compared to like a Japanese bank. So I think that the interest rate on excuse me, it's getting a little bit hot in here. Like my normal savings account in Japan is like 0.001% or like 0.01%. So it's essentially nothing. But I use a high interest online savings account as well. And the interest rate on that is more than 2%. I believe it's like 2.1 or 2.2% right now. And I'm not going to give names. I shouldn't have given the name of the bank that I used earlier because that's kind of personal information that I don't want to like spill. So I'll probably have to bleep that out, as you guys will see. But there are many online high interest banks that you can use as an American overseas. So this is one of the really good options. So like when I make my money on my Patreon account each month, what I do is rather than sending that to my PayPal account where I won't get any interest on that, I send it immediately to my high interest online savings account where I get a little bit of interest every single day that there's money inside of that account. And only when necessary, I then send money from that account to my local Japanese account when I'm paying for things like rent or, utilities or whatever it might be, groceries and things like that. But again, I do try and use my my Rakuten card, my credit card, because I can get points on that as well. So I actually pay with groceries, and every time that I go to a convenience store and things like that, I always use my credit cards so that I can get points on that as well. So whenever I get paid, almost all that money goes to my my high interest online savings account, and it accumulates interest a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit more. And then only when necessary, again, I send that money back to Japan and always try and use that money using a credit card so that I can get more points. So I believe that this is the best option. But again, high interest online savings accounts only go so far because you're getting, again, like maybe 2%, maybe like 2.25%, maybe like 3% if you do what's a COD, certificate of deposit. And what that is with a savings account, you can take out the money anytime, usually with only a little bit of fees. So maybe like $1 to take out essentially as much as you want. You can send that anywhere else in the world or to any other bank that you're already connected with. So, but with a COD rather than a savings account, that money is locked in there. So you can say, okay, for this money, I'll say arbitrary number, $3,000. I choose that I'm not going to be able to touch this money for 3 years, but because I won't be touching it, because the bank will have total control over it, I'll get a higher interest rate. So maybe like 2.7% or something like that. So CODs are another option that's I think pretty good for people that are a little bit more conservative, but that are using high interest online savings accounts through banks that offer those services, because they also typically offer a certificate of deposit accounts as well. So you'll see both of those, and it's probably best to have most of your money in the high interest online savings account, and then maybe a little bit, only as much as you really don't need because you can't touch that money, in a certificate of deposit account, because the interest rate will be higher, but you can never touch it. So it's a little bit more risky. Okay, so the next thing is like stocks, investing. So I don't know. I guess I will just say this. So Americans only have one option when it comes to, not one option, but there's only one major brokerage firm, stock investing company that Americans can use outside of the States, as far as I know. And that company is Interactive Brokers. So you can't sign up for like a Vanguard account or like a Charles Schwab account or like a Merrill Lynch accounts or anything like that if you're an American living in Japan. I know that you can make those accounts if you're living elsewhere in the world, but they don't offer services to Americans living in Japan right now. But the company Interactive Brokers does. So I do have a brokerage account with them, and I also invest a fair amount of my money into the stock market directly. So some of my money goes into the savings account, and then a little bit of money each month that I get from Patreon and YouTube and the various like little things that I do. A little bit of that, not an insignificant amount by any means, but some of that money each month that's not going into that savings account or the certificate of deposits, I then move to my Interactive Brokers account and invest into the stock market. And I only invest into ETFs, and ETFs are exchange traded funds. So it's kind of like baskets of stocks, and you can get instant diversification. So rather than buying like just Apple's stock or just Amazon stock, which is, it can be tempting, or like Tesla's stock, it can be very tempting because you see, oh, well, like it's going up so much, I can make a lot of money. It's very, very risky because you never know, like when Tesla's going to have like a recall of like, I don't know, defective battery crash or something like that. And Apple, they've been in the news for kind of like fishy practices with their batteries and stuff like that. So anytime something like that happens, you're going to have there's going to be a lot more risk involved. But if you have an ETF that has maybe 1,000 different stocks inside of it, you can just buy like 100 shares of that ETF, and you'll be much more because you're much more diversified with your investments. Even if one stock goes down a little bit, as long as there's not a major market crash, you'll still be you'll be in a much better position. Is what I'm trying to say. So I only invest into ETFs, and I think that this is the best option. I won't go into the real specifics, but I do a little bit of dividends. And what a dividend is whenever a company makes a profit. If it's a company that is a publicly traded company and they make profits, and so not every company does this, but sometimes what companies do when they make a profit is they return a little bit of that profit to their shareholders. So again, if like Apple made, I don't know, $100 billion, arbitrary number, obviously, for a certain year, then maybe they would say, okay, we had such an amazing year that we're going to give everyone that owns stock in Apple, for each stock in Apple that they have, they'll get $1 at the beginning of each quarter, or at the end of each quarter. So that's what a dividend is when a company pays back its profits or its revenues to its investors. And rather than you holding onto a stock and that stock just hoping that stock will raise in value over time, you'll get direct cash that you can either put back into that same stock, or you can invest it into a stock that doesn't pay out dividends, but the value is gradually increasing over time. So I do a fair amount of ETFs, I do a fair amount of dividends, but everything is through Interactive Brokers, because that's essentially the only brokerage account, stock trading account that I could make as an American living in Japan. And again, another thing I want to reiterate real quickly is that if you're an American and if you buy an ETF that's not an ETF created and managed by an American brokerage firm, so if I buy an ETF that has only American stocks in it, again, but that ETF is managed by a Japanese company, even if it's the exact same stocks as an equivalent American ETF, I'll get charged much more from the IRS. I'll have to pay much more money to the American government when I make a profit by either selling it or getting the dividends from that ETF, because the IRS doesn't like it when Americans invest into foreign markets, essentially. So if you're an American, you want to invest through American companies. That doesn't mean that you can't invest internationally. So if you're an American and you go through a company like, again, like Charles Schwab or Vanguard or whatever it might be, they might have an ETF that's comprised of only international stocks. But if that ETF is managed by that company, it's traded on the New York Stock Exchange, and it's an American managed ETF, then even if the stocks inside of that are international, you're okay, I believe. So if you're an American, just be a little bit more cautious and read up a little bit. I try and invest primarily into the American stock market. And I go through Interactive Brokers because that's essentially the only option available to me. There's a bunch of like robo investing services that are now available in Japan as well. So like Theo is one of them. It's again like this Wealthfront or Betterment or various services like that Lending Club. There's, that's like peer-to-peer investing services. But if you're an American, again, you can't use robo solutions from the States, and you also can't use robo solutions that are offered in Japan as well. So you can give up to $10,000 a year to your spouse. The Japanese government will tolerate that. And then you can have them invested into a robo service. But the robo advising investing services that are provided by various Japanese companies typically have much higher rates than their American counterparts. And also, I feel like you can do much better than if you just go into the stock market and invest into ETFs. So I think that's not only the better option, but that's basically the only feasible option if you're an American living in Japan, as far as I know. So if you're an American and you live in Japan, it's probably best to create an Interactive Brokers account and an online high-interest savings account with some bank that offers that to Americans living abroad, and then to just go into the stock market with highly diversified ETFs. Yes, so that's what I do in terms of investing. And it's I've only been investing for, I don't know, a couple, 2 or 3 years right now, but I wish that I had started much earlier. Well, I'll get into this in a little bit because a lot of people asked about Jet, but like if you're starting Jet and you can save even like $500 a month or like $1,000 a month if you're living in the inaka and maybe you get your housing paid for you. If you save that much money and you're saving $12,000 a year, and then that goes up by, I don't know, 5%, which I think is pretty reasonable for an average year in the American stock market, then that'll be that much more money that you have the next year that you can then invest later. So with cumulative interest, essentially, the more money that you have, you can always make more and more interest on that. So there's a blog called Mr. Money Mustache, and he had a good line on there where he said, you need to think of every single dollar that you have as like a little worker. Money isn't just something that you can trade for goods and commodities. You can use money itself to make more money even if it's static, so to speak, and through investing. So get started investing as soon as you possibly can, whether it's just through high interest online savings or a COD or various options in the stock market. Get started as soon as you can. Okay, now personal local account. Okay, so people ask a lot, various number of people ask questions about taxes. So as an American, again, sorry, I apologize profusely to all of the non-Americans out there, but I can only speak from my own personal perspective as an American living in Japan. So basically, I know that if you're not an American, you'll have a lot more flexibility when it comes to like using services that are provided by the Japanese government, like various Japanese brokerage firms. You should be able to make an account with them. So that's an option, but as an American, you can't. So going back to taxes, if you're an American living abroad in Japan, so this is kind of cool. Not too many people know about this. I didn't know about this for a long time as well, but you don't have to pay any money that you make from what I do right now is I create videos online, and I get my money, the majority of my money each month, from Patreon, which is an American company. So even though I'm working in Japan, even though that money is coming from an American company, because I'm doing the work in Japan, the IRS, the American Internal Revenue Service, doesn't tax any of that money, I believe up to about $100,000. So even though that money is being generated from an American company, not an American company, but it's coming from an American company, the American government doesn't tax that money. So if you're an American living in Japan and you make less than $100,000 a year, you basically only have to pay taxes to either or. So either only the Japanese government or only the American government. And 99% of circumstances, you'll be paying money just to the local Japanese government. So I do fairly well right now, but I don't, and I never have paid any taxes to the American IRS, the American government, since I moved to Japan. And that's because I pay into the Japanese tax system instead. So a lot of people say, well, like, what about like YouTube? Well, that's, again, money that's being generated through an American company. Do you report that to the IRS, or do you report it in Japan? And you report it in Japan. At least that's what my American and my Japanese tax accountant tell me. So you'll never get really double taxed unless you're over that $100,000 a year threshold. And if you are over that threshold, you should hire an accountant anyways, because that's probably going to be more lucrative for you in the long run. But excuse me, I'm just going to check time real quick. Yeah, okay. You never have to worry about double taxation, basically, is what I'm trying to say here. So I have both a local tax accountant that handles all of my local taxes when I report my taxes each year in Japan, as well as I use a service called Greenback Tax Services, or Greenback Taxes, or something like that. It's like it's an American company specifically created. It's a group of accountants that are familiar with American expats, so Americans living abroad outside of the States. Because if you're an American living outside of Japan, you still have to report your income. You just don't have to, again, pay any taxes on that as long as you're below a certain threshold. So I think they charge about $400, maybe it was $500 a year. So I send them all of my receipts, all of, a breakdown of my expenses, and like my money from Patreon, my money from Google, all of my income, as well as, again, all of my expenses. Like if I got a new office chair, a new keyboard, or whatever, I deduct all of that and I send all of that to them, and then they report it for me. So I never have to write out the 1099 stuff like that. I think the 2555, which is like for Americans living in Japan. Basically, all you guys know this if you're an American, but reporting your taxes each year is the most frustrating and annoying thing in the world. And that's the last thing that I want to have to deal with. So even if I have to pay someone $400 or $500 to do it on my behalf, I would gladly do that, such that in the time that I would be doing that, I can actually be doing something like this instead. So I file my American taxes each year through Greenback Taxes. And then I have a local Japanese accountant that lives in Oita that I work with to report all of that same income when I report it to the Japanese government. So each year, and I've been using him for about a year and a half now, I guess, because I tried to file my taxes by myself as an American in Japan that's self-employed, and it was like the biggest nightmare in the world. The local tax office people, they're all very nice, and they try to be very helpful, but to be honest, none of them are really kind of up to speed with things like YouTube or Patreon or PayPal. Like most of them had never even heard of PayPal, which is a little bit shocking, I think. So I went in and I basically said, this is how much money I made, and these are my expenses. And they basically said, we don't know what any of this is, but as long as you have these numbers, we should be able to make something work. So I basically had to talk things out with them for like 3 or 4 hours, and it was just this big giant headache, and I was really worried about whether I was getting like the best deal or not. And not the best deal, but if you're self-employed, a lot of times you don't know about various deductions that can be made from your taxes. So what a deduction is when you report your taxes at the end of the year. So like if you're married, just by being married, you can have what's known as like the spousal deduction. So if you owe the Japanese government, I don't know, if the amount of money that you made at the end of the year is $50,000, that's after you take out things that you've paid for that you use for work, like a computer or this mic or this camera or whatever it might be. So if you made $60,000, but then you take out all your expenses and you're down to $50,000, you can use another deduction like that spousal deduction just for being married in Japan. I think it's around like $3,000. You can deduct again from that $50,000, and then you'll be at $47,000, and then that's the amount of money that the Japanese government can tax you on. So the more deductions that you have, obviously, the better, because that's less money that you'll be paying into the Japanese tax system at the end of the day. And I don't know. I don't want to get too into my own kind of personal philosophy, my own personal beliefs or things like that. But I strongly believe that the Japanese government, as well as the U.S. government, governments in general, I think, are very inefficient at doing most things. So I strongly believe in trying to invest my money directly into companies that are for profit. I think that's much better at the end of the day for basically everyone. But yeah, it's each their own in terms of philosophy. And if you're more on the social side of things, that's totally fine. But I try and do as much as I can to pay as little taxes as possible at the end of each year. And obviously, I always do that in a completely legal and safe way through my various accountants. But just know that there are many deductions that you might not know about, and that if you talk to a local accountant, local Japanese accountant, you could be potentially saving a lot more money than you would be otherwise just by knowing a few things. So here's another good example. If you're self-employed, and so there's basically two categories of people that report their taxes in Japan. And among the self-employed, there are two types. And you have to put in an application for, I think it's called like the blue type, or it might have been the green type. You have to make an application for this type the year before you get the deduction for being that type. So like the first year I reported my taxes on my Patreon income in Japan, I hadn't done that application. And just by not doing that application, I had to pay an additional like $1,000 in taxes or so. So if I had known that just by applying for the blue form the year before, I could have saved $1,000, I obviously would have done that. So if you're self-employed and you have to report your own income this year, definitely talk to a local accountant or go to the local tax office and say, I want to apply for the blue form or whatever it might. I think it's 青色申告だったかな. Yeah, either the blue form or the green form. And just by reporting your taxes through that form, you can get I think it was like at the end of the day, it was like around a $5,000 or $6,000 deduction from the total amount of money that you owe. And again, that would have resulted in around $1,000 less in terms of how much I would have had to pay at the end of the day. So always good to hire an accountant just because of the various knowledge that they can share with you in terms of how you can save your money. So I have accountants for both reporting my American income and my Japanese income. So I think that's a good strategy, and I would recommend it to everyone. Okay, let's see. A lot of people asked about like retirement funds and things like the Japanese, like social security and things like that. So this is another good example of why it can be good to have a local tax accountant. So whether you're self-employed in Japan or whether you are whether you're working at a company or a nonprofit or whatever it might be, you're going to have to pay into the Japanese pension system, and that's called the Kokumin Nenkin. And I think it's a flat fee for everyone that pays into it, regardless of how much you pay. And I think it was about $150 a month. So right now I pay that. I have to pay for both myself and my wife. And you pay into that, and the government controls all of that money. And theoretically, at the when I turn 60, I'll get that money back, and then some, because it'll be, well, basically, when I'm old, the young people then that are paying for it in 40 years, 30 years from now, they'll be paying for my pension, my Social Security. But as everyone knows, the population in Japan is shrinking dramatically, and this means, and also people in Japan live for a really, really, really long time. So more and more people in Japan each year, the number of old people is growing, not exponentially, but it's growing much quicker than the number of people that are being born. So the older people are outpacing the younger people, essentially. And what this means is that the money that goes to the people that are retired through the Japanese government, every year, it's the young people, the new graduates that are paying that money, and they have to pay more and more and more. And because a lot of the people that are living, again, in Japan after retirement, they're not dying at like 75 years old or 80 years old. They're maybe passing away at like 100 years old. That means they're getting 40 years worth of their pension money. And that puts a major stress on the people that are currently working. So more and more people are paying, not more and more people, the young people right now that are working in Japan are paying a little bit more, such that the people, the growing older demographic segment, can continue to get that money. And because the young people in Japan don't vote very much, most of the older people vote. The politics are, as far as I can tell, they're oriented towards that older population. So the older population typically, again, as far as I can tell, votes for things that benefit them. And this means that the money typically, the young people, unbeknownst to them to a large degree, because a lot of people just aren't involved with politics at all, as far as I can tell. Again, this is all anecdotal, obviously, but basically there's a giant stress right now on the Japanese pension system because of the demographic problems that are happening right now. So you have to pay into the Japanese pension system, but I don't trust the Japanese pension system very much. So in addition to paying into that, the Kokumin Nenkin, the official Japanese government system, one of the things that my local Japanese tax accountant introduced to me is there's this additional type of retirement fund that you're eligible for if you're self-employed and you make, I think it was like less than either like $150,000 a year, or like if you have less than 5 people that you are in your company or whatever it might be. Basically, it's a pension plan for small-scale businesses and individual workers. So right now, I pay about how much was it? Maybe $600 a month into that, and that's like a sliding system. So you can pay up to, I think it was up to $700 a month, and you can change that money as you go. So like if I'm doing well right now and I'm putting in $600 a month, but then next year at this time I'm not doing so well, I can move that down to like $100 a month. But the reason that I'm putting money into that system is because with retirement funds, you can write off that money as I don't know if as a deduction is the right word, but like if again, this is kind of back to the basics. But if I make $1,000 each month, and then I have to report that to the Japanese government, and I say I made this much money, they'll say, okay, you don't have any expenses, you don't have any deductions, so we'll take 25% of this or 20% of this, whatever it might be. But if you put some of that money into a retirement fund, like $100, because it's a retirement fund, you can write that off. So the money that you report to the Japanese government, again, it won't be $1,000, it'll be $900. So they'll say, okay, so you're making $1,000, but $100 goes into a retirement fund, so we can only tax $900 a month from you. That's the amount that we can tax. Not that we're not going to take $900 from you, but we can only tax that amount of money. So we'll take, again, like 10%, 20% of $900, right? So the benefits of creating a retirement fund is that you can essentially use that money. You won't be able to touch it for a very long time, but rather than paying that to the government, that might be using it for something that you don't approve of, or they might be wasting it, or they might be using it effectively. But that's money that you can save for you, and that you'll get when you retire. So in addition to paying into the Kokumin Nenkin, the official government pension system, social security system, I also pay into this small scale pension fund each month. So again, it was like $600 a month. I'm not sure. I have a lot of expenses each month and a lot of transactions that go a lot of different ways. But because I have several different revenue streams. So again, there's YouTube, there's Patreon, I make like a tiny bit of money each month from like the books that I wrote, like on Amazon and stuff like that. And then I do some stuff with Yahoo. So again, a lot of like little transactions, and I'm not 100% sure off the top of my head where everything's going right now, but I do have some of that money going into that small scale pension fund in addition to the normal pension fund as well. And again, the benefit of doing that is because that's more money that you won't have to pay to the government. You won't have access to it immediately, but that'll be money that you can get when you retire later on. And again, because I feel like the whole pension system in Japan is so stressed right now that I don't think actually that we'll be getting our pension when we're 60 years old or 65 years old. I think it'll actually be like when we're like 70 years old, because everyone's life expectancy in Japan is growing, right? It's getting longer and longer each year. So I don't have confidence in the Japanese government to support me and my family just through the Kokumin Nenkin. So there's the pension that I pay into, there's the small scale pension that I pay into, that I get, deductions from both of that. And then besides both of those, I have all of my separate investing as well. So again, there's a lot of different avenues where you can save money and where you can invest money, but it's always just good to be aware of all the options, because there's always potential ways that you can save money. And the more money that you have, again, the more leverage, the more money you can the more money that you have, the more money that you can get just by having that money. That's like the basic rule of investing, but I digress. So let's see, what else did I want to cover? I think that's mostly everything. A few people asked me about things like iDeco and like NISA and stuff like that, but from what I've read and from what my local Japanese tax accountant has told me about these, is that it's kind of dangerous, again, for Americans to use these kind of funds, because even though the tax benefits on these they're basically Japanese retirement plans. So like you can invest that $700 a month or however much it might be. You can get that deducted from the amount of money that you would pay to the Japanese government each year. But the benefit is that there's additional tax benefits. So like if you make money investing that $700 a month through something like iDeco or NISA into various stock indexes or whatever it might be. When you make money from that, like if you've invested in a high dividend yielding stock option through NISA or through iDeco, you might not get taxed at all. That's like one of the benefits of having these accounts, is that they're tax exempt up to a certain threshold. So even if you make money from dividends, or even if you sell stocks that you hold through in that particular retirement fund, although I'm not sure how you would even do that, because I think it's locked in to a certain degree. Anyways, there's many benefits to investing in iDeco, through iDeco and through NISA, but it's very complicated if you're an American. So for the time being, I've chosen to not touch those, because I'd rather not make a mistake right now and realize I have to pay much more in taxes at the end of the day. So if you're not an American, certainly do a lot of research on iDeco and NISA, because again, as far as I know, these are both very good options for long-term retirement funds. And you want to have a retirement fund because again, the Japanese pension system isn't going to cut it. In 20, 30 years, it's going to be a nightmare, big time. So definitely look into those. Okay, so that's basically a simple rundown. I've been talking for about 50 minutes of the various things that I do with my money in Japan. And now I'm going to try and answer some questions. So let's just get into this. Sorry, I wanted to do that to kind of go through my experiences beforehand, because I knew that it would answer many people's questions, many of the questions that I received. So now let's get into the questions. Sorry. I'm a student that will soon attend university in Japan. I also want to work there after graduation. However, I'm not planning to spend my whole life there. Like returning to the U.S. later on, how does one manage trying to have a foot in both the U.S. and Japan? For example, I'm going to take out student loans and be paying them, plus being young and just starting to build credit. I want to continue building it after those loans are paid by using things like a credit card in daily life. A very good idea, especially once I'm employed. But I will be living in Japan, earning yen and spending under their banks. Is there a way to go back and forth easily? That would be TransferWise. Use TransferWise. I was thinking getting an international card without fees for spending abroad and using PayPal or another online type service. I remember that you recommend using PayPal. Yeah, again, that was my mistake. I apologize for that. To exchange my yen into the US account and then spend it back in Japan with them. Okay. One of the things that I want to point out is that okay, so if you're making money in Japan and you live in Japan, and that money again it's being generated in Japan, and it's going from somewhere in Japan to your bank account, that's going to be taxed by the Japanese government no matter what. But if you're living in Japan and that money is being generated in the United States and you're sending it from the United States to Japan, you only have to report that money. You only have to pay taxes on that money let's see. I believe there's different kind of like ranks, categories that non-Japanese people fall into when it comes to reporting taxes in Japan. So like if you are studying abroad in Japan and you're doing like an online part-time job that's generating money in the US and that money never gets sent to Japan, you don't have to pay any Japanese taxes on that, period, as far as I know. But if you're next rank up and let's say you've been living in Japan for, like 2 or 3 years, and you're sending money, you're generating money in the States and you're sending that to Japan, then you'll be taxed only on the amount of money that you send to Japan. And then the next rank up after that is like you've been living in Japan for 5 years and you intend on living in Japan permanently. I think the stipulation was that you've been living in Japan for at least 5 years in the past 10 years. If you meet that requirement, then any amount of money that you make from whether it's generated in Japan or outside of Japan, and regardless of whether or not you send that money to Japan, you will be taxed on it. So what I mean by that is most of the money that I make each month through my various online endeavors never gets sent to Japan. So if I make arbitrary number $4,000 a month total through both Patreon and Google and Yahoo and all the things that I'm involved in. Let's just say, hypothetically speaking, that all that money was generated in the States. Even if I only sent 10% of that $400 each month to Japan to pay for things like groceries and maybe rent if I was living in a very cheap apartment, stuff like that, really cheap apartment, I would still be taxed I would still have to be taxed on not the $400 I sent to Japan, but on the total $4,000 that I make because I've been living in Japan for at least 5 years of the past 10 years that I've been living in Japan. So this again is just, it's the tax system that the Japanese government has set up. And I don't know if I said everything perfectly, but if you go to, I think it's japanguide.com, and then you just basically go to their taxes section, they lay out each category. You'll be living in Japan, earning yen and spending under their banks. Anytime you need to send that to the US, yes, use TransferWise. But the thing that I wanted to say about your particular situation is that it'd be good if you have a part-time job that's generating money from the US, whether you do something like YouTube or whatever it might be, because if you're only in Japan temporarily, then if you don't send that money from the States to Japan, if you leave it in your American account, then you don't need to pay Japanese taxes on it because you're only going to be in Japan temporarily. So I can't do that. I have to report all of my income that I make from the States, regardless of whether or not it comes to Japan again. But for you, because you're only going to be here temporarily, you won't meet that 5-year or 3-year threshold, or the 5-year threshold. You should be able to keep all of that money in the States and never have to pay any Japanese taxes on it. But go to japanguide.com and go to their tax page and find out exactly which bracket you fall under. Okay, let's see. I would really like to know about retirement plans. I have my company one, but I feel like it won't be enough for the future. So this person was asking about iDeCo and NISA. And I think I did a pretty good job of addressing those. If you're an American, I wouldn't recommend setting up an iDeCo or NISA account. Even if you're married to a Japanese spouse that can make one and you can invest through them, and that's because, again, the maximum amount of money that you can gift each year to your spouse in Japan is $10,000. So for some people that would be good, but if you plan on investing more than if you plan on putting more than $10,000 a year into a retirement fund, it might be okay through your spouse, but I don't know enough about iDeCo and NISA to really give a strong recommendation, but I think that for the time being, probably, I don't know your nationality, but I think that, and I also don't know if you're going to be in Japan for the long term or not, but if you're not American, look into iDeCo and look into NISA. If you are American, I would go with Interactive Brokers. You'll have to pay into the Japanese pension system regardless. And finally, what I would do is, you have a company one. I don't know if the company one that you're talking about is the Kokumin Nenkin, like if it's the Japanese government retirement plan or not. The first thing I would do is try and figure out more about your particular retirement fund that you're paying into. Check with your company, figure out exactly what your retirement fund, what kind of retirement fund that you have right now. If you have two, you're probably okay. And you wanted me to talk about Patreon. So I talked about that earlier, but again, because I've been living in Japan for more than 5 years, in the past 10 years, all of the money that I make from Patreon each month, I report. even if none of that money that month comes to Japan, even if I, sent a good amount of money the previous month to Japan such that I don't need to send any money this month to Japan, I still have to report all of the money that I made from all of my various revenue streams each month to the Japanese government. So I make money on Patreon, then I send it to both my high interest account and to my my brokerage account. But when I make that set number of money each month, again, let's say arbitrary number, again, $4,000, that's the money that I have to report to my Japanese local tax accountant. So I say, as soon as that, when I see the amount of money that has been deposited into my high interest online savings account, I take a screenshot of that and I send it to my Japanese local tax account and I say, this is how much money I made each month. And then from that point, assuming that I'll have to pay a certain number of money on taxes on that, I deduct that tax amount, and then I invest the remainder of that. And then I leave a little bit in there for whenever I need to send that money back to Japan. So hopefully that answered your question with regards to Patreon. You won't have to pay American taxes on that if you're an American living in Japan, as long as you're reporting it to Japan. You'll have to report it to the American government as well, but you won't have to pay taxes on it as long as you're below the $100,000 a year threshold. So the other thing I want to really quickly address is that if you're living in Japan and you have multiple income streams and you're not self-employed. So for a very long time, I was working at APU and doing Patreon. You don't have to report anything up to, I think, $2,000 a year. That's additional income. So like the first year that I did Patreon, I made less than $2,000 a year. So I was paying Japanese local taxes on my APU salary, but I wasn't paying any on the $2,000, the less than $2,000 a year I made from Patreon. But the next year I made more than $2,000. So as soon as you make more than $2,000 a year on a side income besides a company, you have to start reporting that. You have to start reporting it. Again, it depends what bracket you're in. For me, I had to report it because even though I wasn't sending all of it to Japan again, because I was in the 5-year plus bracket. If you've only been in Japan for like 2 years, you might not need to report that income if that money never reaches Japan. So again, go to japanguide.com and figure out which tax bracket you fall into, because depending on how long you've been living in Japan and your specific financial circumstances, you will have to always report income, but you might not always have to pay taxes on that income. So let's see. Next question. I'm planning to apply to the JET program from America. What should I do to make the move as simple as possible? Like, is there a specific bank that I should, etc.? Okay. What'll probably happen with the thing with JET is that it's very circumstantial. So what I mean by that is that some people go to the inaka, the middle of nowhere, and then they get their housing paid for them by the local education board, such that they're making the same flat $3,000 a month, basically, that everyone in every single JET is making, but they don't have to pay housing and they're living in a very cheap part of Japan. On the other hand, the other side of the spectrum, you could have someone that's placed in like the middle of Tokyo on the JET program that doesn't have their housing paid for them. They're immediately like $1,000 in the hole. So again, JET is very circumstantial, but the good thing to know is that $3,000 a month immediately out of college is more than almost all Japanese new graduates will be making. So provided that you're not provided that you live somewhat frugally, you should be able to save at least $500 a month approximately, if not more. So like I was living in Oita, where I live right now, on the JET program, and I lived pretty frugally. I had like a $300 a month apartment, and I was able to save about $1,000 a month when I was on the JET program. And by the time that I quit, I had about $25,000, $30,000 from 3 years on the JET program of savings. Even though I bought like a brand new motorcycle the first year that I was there, although albeit a very like small one, not a very expensive one, but you can still live not super frugally and still save a fair amount of money, because $3,000 is more than most Japanese people will be making. So it's good to be aware of. But what I would actually recommend is creating a Rakuten. So Rakuten is kind of like the Japanese Amazon. I would recommend creating an account with them because they offer a lot of, or even a Japanese Amazon.com account. I think that they offer cards as well. And then creating a credit card with them such that every time you use your credit card to buy something in Japan, because you'll be going to a lot of convenience stores, regardless of who you are. If you're living in Japan, you're going to be going to convenience stores. So always use your credit card that accumulates points or cash back or whatever it might be when you go to a convenience store. So make a Rakuten Ginko and try and put as many expenses as possible, whether it's like your monthly electricity bills or whatever it might be, because you can always get you can always get points on that money if you pay through your card. So I would recommend Rakuten Ginko. Rakuten Bank. That's a good one. Although you'll probably, no matter what, the local education board will probably have you open an account with the local large bank account as well. So like when I first moved here, I created an account with Oita Bank, and I still have an account with them. I can't stand Oita Bank. I think that they're basically, I won't say too many bad things about them, but I put as little money as possible into my Oita Bank account each month, because not only do I not get a return at all on any of that money, but every time I go to the bank, it's always, people know I'm not a big fan of Oita Bank is what I'm trying to say. Okay, let's move on. Is there any kind of safe savings account in Japan for someone that yet does not know if will buy a house or do larger investment for next 5 years? I'm not entirely sure what you're trying to say. Safe kind of savings account in Japan? Well, I'll kind of go back to what I said earlier along the lines of Japanese banks don't offer very good interest rates in terms of the savings accounts. So again, I think the best option is always to have as little money as possible in your local Japanese bank account and to have as much money as possible in a high online savings account that many different companies offer right now. So go to nerdwallet.com and look up high interest online savings account, and they'll have a list of options that even as an American living abroad, you should be able to sign up for. And even if you're not in the stock market, because again, I don't know if you're an American, I don't know if I can recommend Interactive Brokers to you or not, but at the very minimum, a high interest online savings account is a good option for the overwhelming majority of people. And then just to use TransferWise only when necessary. So if you make $3,000 a month, let's say you're on the JET program, okay? If you make $3,000 a month and let's say you have to spend $1,000, $1,500 a month through various expenses. Maybe that's rent, maybe that's utilities, maybe that's groceries, all of that put together and like your car insurance and stuff like that. And then maybe you want to have an additional $500 for shopping. I don't know, you want to have like your Netflix account, you want to have maybe like karaoke night with friends a couple times a month. Maybe you have a girlfriend, a significant other. $500 is, going to pleasures. The various ways that you want to enjoy yourself as a member of society. But if you're able to save about $1,000 of that $3,000 account, as long as you are saving that, as long as you have that initial $1,500 each month set away to pay for your housing and utilities and all those things, if you put that additional $1,000 into that high interest online savings account under the assumption that you'll never have to put it back, you'll never have to send it back to Japan using TransferWise, because you still have to pay some amount of money when you use TransferWise. And if you use TransferWise like multiple times a month, even though TransferWise is very, very cheap compared to PayPal, if you're using it very, very frequently, then it defeats the purpose of putting your money into a high interest online savings account to begin with, because you might be spending more money on transfer fees than you're making in interest to begin with. So always make sure that you only put the amount of money that you never need to send back to Japan into your high interest online savings account is, I think, probably a good option for you and probably for most people. Okay. I think one of my daughters might have woken up. Please give me 1 second. She did. I'll be right back. Okay, so one of my daughters has woken up, and I'm going to have to give her food pretty soon, but I'm going to end the video right here. There was still a fair number of questions that I want to answer, but I'm not going to have time today. So what I'm going to try and do is, because these videos aren't too difficult for me to make now that I don't have to really edit as much, as I'll try and do a follow-up video to this video in maybe like a week or two. So if there's any additional questions that I can answer for you guys, please leave a comment below and I'll try and answer those in the next video. And I apologize in this video if I got a little too personal in terms of it's okay. In terms of my own beliefs when it comes to things like economics and the role of government and stuff like that. Everyone's entitled to their own beliefs, and I don't try and push mine onto other people. But yeah, so apologies if I got a little bit too into that, but she's getting a little grumpy, so I gotta go, and I'll talk to you guys again soon. Bye.